Welcome, dear listener. You found a quiet corner of the night, where stories breathe slowly and ancient voices echo softly through the dark. Tonight, we journey into the timeless myth of Hades and Persephone, a tale of shadow and bloom, silence and return, endings that are not endings. If you enjoy stories like this, whispers beneath the surface of sleep, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a gentle like. It helps more wandering souls find their way here. Now, close your eyes, let the world grow quiet, and let us begin. Chapter 1, Born of Silence. Before there were kings, before there were temples, before even the sun had chosen its place in the sky, there was only silence. A deep, endless silence that stretched across the cosmos like a sleeping sea. From this stillness, the first forces began to stir. Slow as glaciers, heavy as mountains, ancient as breath itself. These were not yet gods, not yet thoughts or stories. They were simply truths. The sky, the earth, the ocean, time, night. And from these truths came the titans, great and mighty beings born of the primal elements, shaped from the bones of chaos and the whispers of eternity. They were tall as storms and old as dust, and among them were Cronus, who ruled over time with an unyielding scythe, and Rhea, his sister and queen, whose hands cradled the seeds of life. Together, they bore 6 children, divine sparks that would one day shape the fates of gods and mortals alike. But fear clung to Cronus like a shadow. He had heard a prophecy, murmured through the threads of time, that one of his children would rise against him and bring his reign to an end. And so, with every birth, he reached out and swallowed the child whole, burying them deep inside his timeless body. First Hestia, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Each child vanished into the dark within him, their cries unheard, their power suppressed. When Hades was born, the fourth among his siblings, the world did not tremble. There was no lightning in the sky, no burst of fire or song. He arrived into existence as quietly as a sigh, wrapped in the hush of the deep and the unseen. From the moment of his first breath, there was something different about him. He did not wail or flail. He did not demand to be known. Instead, he observed. His eyes, dark and ancient even in infancy, opened not in wonder, but in awareness. As Cronus' hand reached again, swallowing the newborn god as he had done with the others, Hades did not resist. He simply disappeared into his father's vast body, slipping into a realm of stillness that was neither life nor death. There, inside the Titan's belly, Hades floated, alone, yet not lonely. There was no light, no sound, no movement, only the soft, eternal murmur of time itself. It was in that darkness that his nature began to take shape. While his siblings may have struggled or wept, Hades listened. He watched. He waited. The silence did not frighten him. It became a companion. In that endless quiet, he learned the shape of patience. He learned how to feel the spaces between things, between breaths, between beats of the heart, between what was and what might be. He did not dream of the sky or the sea, as his brothers one day would. He dreamed of roots, of caverns, of the deep earth that no god had yet claimed. Though there were no stars where he was, Hades began to understand the constellations of thought. Though there was no wind, he imagined the movement of memory, of time folding in on itself. He became intimate with stillness, with the dignity of endings. This was not a prison to him, it was an awakening. While the world above turned, and time carved its path through the heavens, Hades remained in a place where time barely stirred. He felt the weight of lifetimes pressing softly against him, not as burdens, but as promises. Promises of what would come, promises of what he would become. His siblings floated there too, though they were unaware of each other, each wrapped in their own slumber, their own dreams. But Hades was awake in a way none of them were, not with the fire of rebellion or the hunger for escape, but with quiet attention. He was already learning to be what he would someday become: the silent keeper, the watcher of thresholds, the god who did not command the skies or the seas, but who held the final key, the last door, the deep place where all stories must one day go. And so he waited, not as a prisoner, but as a seed beneath the soil, knowing that darkness was not the end, but the beginning. Time passed, though in that place beyond reckoning, it did not pass as mortals know it. There were no sunrises, no moons to measure the nights. Only the slow pulse of eternity moved through the belly of Cronus, where the swallowed gods lay dormant in their quiet exile. But far beyond the Titan's body, far above the silence where Hades waited, something had changed. Rhea, mother of the devoured children, could no longer bear the weight of her sorrow. She had watched 5 of her children disappear into her husband's grasp, and when the time came for her 6th child to be born, she made a different choice. Zeus, the youngest, was delivered not into Cronus's hands, but hidden away in a cave upon the island of Crete, nourished in secret by sacred goats and guarded by beings who masked his cries with song and steel. The world above had not forgotten the swallowed gods. It had simply paused for them. And as Zeus grew strong, the future began to stir. Rhea's hope, small and flickering like a flame in wind, would become the spark that set the old world ablaze. When Zeus came of age, he returned to the realm of gods and challenged his father's rule. With cleverness and courage, he tricked Cronus into drinking a potion, bitter and binding, that reached deep into the Titan's belly and stirred the divine prisoners within. One by one, the gods were released. First Hestia, warm and calm, then Demeter, whose presence brought the breath of spring. Hera followed, proud and golden, then Poseidon, whose pulse echoed like the tides. And then, at last, came Hades. He did not tumble forth in rage or confusion. He emerged with quiet certainty, standing still while the air greeted him like an old friend. The world had changed since he had last seen it. Light poured from the heavens, the earth bloomed with newness, and the stars hummed ancient songs he had only ever heard in dreams. But Hades did not stumble or squint. The brightness did not blind him. It simply passed around him, as though it, too, respected his silence. He stood apart from his siblings, not out of pride, but by nature. While Poseidon roared like the sea and Zeus burned like the sky, Hades was still, steady, watching everything. He was not eager to fight. But when the war against the Titans began, he did not hesitate. The Titanomachy, the great war between the new gods and the old, shook the foundations of the cosmos. Mountains fell into the sea, the sky split open with lightning, and even time seemed to weep. For 10 years, the battles raged, thunder clashing with stone, fire with shadow. But through it all, Hades fought without shouting. He struck with purpose, not fury. His blade was not driven by vengeance, but by the need for balance. The old order had grown stagnant, rooted in fear. And fear, Hades understood more than most, must be faced, not fled from. When the Titans were at last defeated and cast into Tartarus, the world exhaled. The new gods stood together, bloodied but unbroken, and faced the question that would shape eternity. How would they divide this newborn world? Lots were drawn. Chance, perhaps guided by fate, placed Zeus in the sky, Poseidon in the sea, and Hades beneath the earth. Some said he received the least, the realm with no light, no song, no worship. But Hades did not argue. He did not frown. He simply nodded, as if he had known all along. The underworld, dark, vast, and silent, was his. It was not a punishment. It was a calling. For while his brothers looked upward and outward, Hades had always looked inward, into the quiet places where endings whispered and beginnings waited in seed and stone. The realm beneath the earth was not yet fully formed. It was a raw canvas of shadow and emptiness. But in that silence, Hades saw potential. He understood the importance of a boundary, the need for someone to care for the lost, the forgotten, the finished. While others feared the dark, he saw its shape, its elegance. And so he turned away from Olympus and its shining towers. He descended into the earth, not in sorrow, but in purpose. It was not exile, it was arrival. And in the deep stillness of the world's roots, the god who had been born in silence found his home. The descent was long, but Hades did not rush. He moved like someone returning to a place they had never seen but somehow remembered. The deeper he traveled, the more the world above began to fade. The winds grew still, the colors muted, and the sounds softened until there was nothing left but the echo of his own heartbeat, steady and calm. There were no roads beneath the earth, no paths carved for travelers, only vast, unmoving shadow. But even in this formless dark, Hades felt no fear. Instead, he felt welcome. The silence was different here than it had been inside Cronus. That silence had been heavy and confined. This was wide, open, full of waiting. The underworld was not yet shaped. It was a great, endless cavern of potential, untouched by chaos or order. A place where death would one day find its rhythm. But for now, it was only stillness. As Hades walked further, the earth began to shift around him, not violently, but like a creature adjusting in sleep. The stone walls opened where he stepped, the ground gently sloping into great valleys and distant echoing halls. He was not creating, not yet, but the realm was responding to him, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for its true king to arrive. Though alone, Hades did not feel lonely. His solitude was not a wound but a comfort, a space where he could think without noise, feel without interruption. He began to observe the nature of this realm, even in its emptiness. It was not lifeless, merely unoccupied. It felt like a library before the books had been written, or a house before a single lamp was lit. He walked for what may have been days or years. Time had no meaning here, and listened to the sound of rock settling, of distant water dripping through cracks in the earth, of silence breathing beside him. And slowly he began to understand what this place needed. Not walls or armies or fire, not triumph or dominion. What it needed was structure. It needed memory. It needed rest. The world above was full of beginnings, of birth, growth, noise, hunger. But down here, something else was required, a keeper, a caretaker of endings, a watcher of what came after the final breath. Hades accepted this without resistance. There was no ceremony, no crown placed on his brow, no celebration of his arrival. But as he sat, for the first time, on a black stone overlooking a deep chasm, he knew that this was his kingdom, not by conquest but by nature. And so, in that sacred silence, Hades began the long and gentle work of shaping his realm. He did not rush to build palaces or carve thrones. Instead, he listened. He sat with the stone and the dark and let the land speak. He envisioned 5 great rivers flowing through the underworld, each one representing a truth he had learned in his time between silence and shadow. The river Styx, cold and unyielding, would bind oaths, so that the living and the divine alike would remember the weight of their promises. The river Lethe would carry forgetting, a kindness, a mercy, so that the most painful memories might fade. The river Acheron would bear sorrow, its waters thick with grief. Cocytus would cry with the voices of those who could not let go. And Phlegethon, burning yet quiet, would carry the cleansing flame of transformation. These rivers, unseen by mortals, would one day welcome every soul. Hades saw it all as though it had already been. He would not command obedience through fear, nor demand worship from those above. Instead, he would wait. The dead would come to him in their own time. He would receive them not as enemies, but as travelers reaching the end of their journey. And when they arrived, he would give them what the world had never given him: peace, stillness, and a place to be forgotten gently. As he looked out over the sleeping land, Hades closed his eyes and breathed in the dark. It smelled of stone and silence. Smelled like home. Chapter 2: The War of the Gods. Long before mortals carved temples into stone or sang praises into the wind, the world was divided not by maps or nations, but by powers older than memory. The Titans, vast and eternal, had shaped the world in their own image. Great beings born from Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. They ruled with the strength of mountains and the patience of time itself. Cronus, their king, had overthrown his own father to take the throne of the cosmos. For a while, his rule was unchallenged, and the world lay quiet beneath the heavy breath of the Titans. But deep within that quiet, a new generation stirred, hidden in the belly of Cronus or growing in secret beneath the trees. The children of Cronus and Rhea, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus were not made in the image of the Titans. They were more fluid, more fierce, more alive. They were gods. When Cronus swallowed each of them, he believed he had stopped time from turning. He thought he could seal the future in darkness. But time, even for Cronus, would not obey forever. When Zeus, the youngest, was hidden from Cronus' hunger and raised among the shadows of a sacred cave, the wheel of fate began to move again. He was raised not with loud proclamations or crowns, but in secrecy, fed on honey and goat's milk, cradled by earth and sky alike. The nymphs who tended to him whispered stories of his siblings, sleeping in the belly of the world. They told him that one day he would rise and break the chain of fear. And so he trained his body and sharpened his mind, but more than anything, he listened. He listened to the wind as it passed over mountaintops, to the deep rumble of the sea, and to the silence where his siblings slept. When he was grown, tall and bright-eyed like the first bolt of lightning, he descended from his hidden refuge and made his way to Cronus. Disguised as a servant, he offered the Titan a drink. A gift, he said, for the king of time. The drink, brewed with magic and memory, reached deep into Cronus' core and disturbed what he had hidden. One by one, the swallowed gods returned to the world, not reborn, but remembered. Hades was among them, rising in stillness while his brothers and sisters gasped in the new light. Together, for the first time, the 6 siblings stood side by side beneath a sky that no longer belonged to the Titans. But the old world would not fall without resistance. Cronus, realizing what had been taken from him, called upon his fellow Titans. The earth shook with their fury, mountains groaned, oceans surged, and stars turned red with warning. The war that followed, the Titanomachy, was not a battle fought in days or even years. It lasted for an age. The battlefield was the world itself. Trees were uprooted and thrown like spears. Rivers were split into new paths. Even the heavens cracked, their constellations shifting like frightened birds. On one side stood the Titans, ancient, immense, and determined to preserve their rule. On the other, the young gods, fierce, glowing with newfound power, driven not by pride, but by the need to bring balance to what had become stagnant. Hades, though quieter than his brothers, stood firm in every battle. He did not shout commands or seek glory. He moved like the shadow of a mountain, steady and unyielding. His presence on the battlefield was subtle but sure. He fought not with chaos, but with calm precision. His weapon was not rage, but inevitability. Where he passed, the ground split softly, as if making room for the future. The war was not constant noise, it had its silences too. Between the roaring of titans and the trembling of the earth, there were moments where nothing moved, as though the very fabric of the world was holding its breath. It was in these pauses that Hades felt most himself. While others roared with fury or charged with thunder in their chests, Hades moved quietly between the shadows of the battlefield. He did not fight for spectacle. He fought for the necessity of change. In those years of conflict, he learned that even war has an order, a rhythm, and a silence of its own. He observed how death touched both sides alike. Titan and god, monster and ally, all subject to the same closing of the eyes, the same final stillness. And perhaps it was during these long battles that the idea of the underworld began to take deeper shape in his mind. Not just as a kingdom to rule, but as a space to hold what could no longer continue. He did not revel in destruction, but he understood it. Not all things are meant to be eternal. Even power, when left unchallenged, begins to decay. The Titans had held the world in stasis, in a grip of fear and immobility. Hades did not desire chaos, but he knew that change was overdue. Balance had been lost, and war, however terrible, was now the only road toward restoring it. The gods gained allies in their struggle. From the deep places of the earth came the Cyclopes, one-eyed smiths who forged mighty weapons, thunderbolts for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, and for Hades a helmet woven from night itself. The helm of darkness, they called it. When worn, it erased Hades from sight and sense alike. He became invisible not just to the eye but to the mind. He could move through enemy ranks like a breath of cold air, unnoticed and unstoppable. It suited him well. While others burst into the fray with fire and roar, Hades slipped in silently, unmaking enemies before they even knew he had passed. He was not cruel. He was not reckless. He did what needed to be done. He bore the weight of war not with excitement, but with resolve. Each time he lowered his blade, he did so without joy, but without hesitation. For him, war was not a fire. It was a long walk through shadow, and every step had its cost. But he paid that cost willingly, for he believed in the shape of what might come after. He dreamed not of thrones or songs of victory, but of peace, true, deep peace, the kind that comes not from triumph, but from order restored. The Titans, though vast and ancient, began to falter. Their strength was built on the past, and the past had grown brittle. The new gods, forged in silence and suffering, had learned the value of cooperation. Zeus led with fire, Poseidon with storm, and Hades with unshakable calm. They became a trinity of balance, sky, sea, and the unseen earth. And as the war stretched on, the tide turned in their favor. Hades struck the final blow against many of Cronus's allies, not with spectacle, but with strategy. He knew when to advance, and when to let silence speak for him. In the end, it was not just strength that won the war, it was vision. The gods were not just fighting for power. They were fighting for a world that breathed again. A world where time moved forward, not in circles of fear. When Cronus was finally brought low, the heavens wept, not for him, but for the end of an age. The Titans were not destroyed, but bound and cast into the deepest pit of Tartarus, a place beneath even Hades' future realm. There, they would sleep in chains, guarded by walls of night and iron, far from the reach of sky and star. The war was over, but its echoes would linger in the bones of the world for all time. When the last echoes of the war faded into the folds of time, and the dust of fallen mountains settled over new valleys, the world stood still. The gods, no longer children swallowed in fear, but beings of immense will, stood together atop the bones of a broken age. They had won, but victory did not feel like celebration. Felt like quiet, the kind that comes after thunder. Together, they looked out at the newly hushed world, which now belonged not to the Titans, but to them. But with power came a question that even the gods could not answer lightly. How would they divide this world? It was Zeus who proposed the drawing of lots, an ancient, sacred method that left fate to speak where voices could not agree. There was no quarrel among them, not yet. They were still brothers, still bonded by blood and war. And so, in a clearing where the first light touched the earth again, the three drew their lots. Zeus drew the sky, vast and clear, filled with thunder and stars. Poseidon drew the sea, deep and restless, cradling mystery and storm. And Hades drew the earth beneath, the underworld, the realm of the dead, the place without sunlight or song. There was no outcry from Hades. He did not ask to draw again, nor question the will of fate. He simply accepted the stone in his palm and the weight that came with it. Some say he received the worst of the three realms, the cold and the sorrowful, the place untouched by worship or joy. But Hades knew differently. As he looked down into the shadowed valleys and the hollow spaces where roots reached like fingers through soil, he saw not loss, but purpose. In his silence, he understood what others could not. The world above, with its brightness and bloom, could not exist without what lay below. Every beginning depended on an ending. Every joy needed a resting place. The underworld was not a punishment. It was a necessity. It would not be his prison, it would be his kingdom. And so, while Zeus rose into the heavens to build Olympus, and Poseidon sank beneath the waves to raise his coral throne, Hades turned and walked alone into the earth. He did not need a fanfare. He did not want one. The ground opened before him with neither resistance nor invitation. It simply allowed him passage, as if the world itself recognized its rightful keeper. Down he went, deeper than roots, deeper than time. The last light of the world above faded behind him, but Hades did not look back. He had no fear of darkness. It had shaped him, after all. As he descended, the shape of his future unfolded before him, not in vision or fire, but in the soft quiet that accompanied each step. He began to imagine not just a realm, but a system, a place of balance, of judgment, of rest. He envisioned rivers that would carry emotion instead of water, judges who would listen not with ears, but with understanding, gates that could not be opened by force, only by faith. His realm would not be loud or glorious, but it would be necessary, sacred, eternal. Hades understood that life's final breath was not the end of meaning. It was the passage into something quieter, more complete. The underworld would not be his exile, it would be his truth. And so he descended, unhurried and alone, into the heart of the world, ready to become not the god of death, but the god of what comes after. The war was over. The world was divided. And in the stillness beneath all things, the quiet king began to shape his kingdom, not with fire or thunder, but with silence, memory, and purpose. Chapter 3. The Descent Below. Hades descended in silence. There was no path waiting for him, no carved road to lead his feet. The world beneath the surface had never known a king, never known a god, never known footsteps that carried such still and patient power. As he moved downward, leaving behind the last tremors of war and the far-off light of Olympus, the ground around him slowly changed. The air became dense, cool, not cold, but quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. Stones shifted with subtle murmurs beneath his steps, as though recognizing their new master. There were no crowds, no followers, no hymns to announce his arrival. Yet the realm seemed to breathe differently as he entered it. He passed beneath layers of the world that no other god had touched. Here, roots reached like veins across ceilings of stone. Caverns opened not with grandeur, but with gravity. Every echo from his movement was swallowed into the walls, into the deep. This was not a place for shouting or spectacle. It was a place where endings lived and waited, where the noise of the world above could not reach. And as Hades moved deeper, the realm did not resist him. It accepted him, folding around him like a blanket drawn over tired shoulders. He did not rush. Every step was a conversation with the dark. The further he traveled, the more he began to feel a resonance. Not sound, but something deeper, something like memory humming inside stone. This was not the chaos of raw creation that Zeus had shaped in the sky, nor the untamed fluidity Poseidon had found in the sea. This was structure waiting to be named, not in the form of walls or towers, but in the form of rhythm. Every silent moment down here was part of a larger stillness. It was as if the underworld had always existed, sleeping quietly beneath the surface of all things, waiting only for someone to understand it. Hades, shaped by quiet, tempered by time inside Cronus, did not seek to conquer this place. He sought to know it, to feel its shape, to listen to its pulse. He began to imagine what it could become. Not a prison, not a grave, but a resting place. A home for what the world no longer held. The idea did not come with trumpets or visions. It came slowly, like a lantern being lit one breath at a time in a vast cave. He understood that he would not rule with noise or dominance. He would govern through stillness, through boundary, through the trust of those who had no one else to watch over them. There was a solemn beauty in what he saw. Pools of black water reflected nothing but stillness. Arching tunnels twisted like forgotten thoughts. Massive pillars of stone stretched up into darkness, as if holding up the weight of the world itself. It was vast, yes, but not empty. It was full of silence, of space, of possibility. Hades stood in the center of one great cavern, where stalactites hung like frozen music above him, and there he paused, not to rest, but to feel the moment. He did not speak, for there was no need. The land knew him, not in words, but in presence. And in return, he felt the underworld's gentle gravity settle over him. Not heavy, not oppressive, but certain. This place did not want a king who ruled by fear. It wanted a keeper, a guardian, a witness, and Hades, quiet and enduring, was all of these things. He closed his eyes and breathed in the air. Not fresh, not fragrant, but honest. It smelled like old stone and still water. It smelled like the end of sound. It smelled like truth. And for the first time since being freed from Cronus, Hades smiled. Not with joy, but with peace. He had found what he was meant to shape. Not above the earth, but beneath it. Not among the living, but with what follows after. In the heart of the underworld, time moved differently. Not slower or faster, but deeper. It flowed like underground rivers, carving gentle paths through stone that no eye could see. Hades sat for a long while in the stillness, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood the importance of listening. The world above rushed and shouted and surged, always pushing forward. But here, in the soil of forgotten things, there was space to hear what had been left unsaid. He placed his hand upon the ground, fingers pressed to cold rock, and in that contact, he felt the gentle pulse of the realm's sleeping form. It did not resist his presence. In fact, it welcomed him, not as a ruler to fear, but as a soul who belonged. So he rose and he began his work, not with chisels or fire, but with intent. There were no beings yet to inhabit this place, no souls to guide or protect, but Hades knew they would come. All mortals, no matter how high they rose or how far they wandered, would one day return to this place beneath all places. And it was his task, his calling, to prepare for them, not to judge, not to punish, but to receive. The first thing he did was walk the borders of his realm, though there were no roads to follow. He mapped the land with steps and silence. He moved through dark tunnels and endless caverns, charting them not with markings but with memory. He traced the flow of invisible winds that passed through hidden arches. He memorized the still lakes, where not even a ripple dared disturb the surface. And in time, he began to understand the layout that already existed, the natural shape of the realm. He did not force change upon it. He listened to its intention and followed it. And then he began to name things, for naming was a kind of blessing. To name something was to see it, to acknowledge that it had a place. He named the great rivers that would eventually guide souls to their destinations. Styx, where oaths and truths would be tested. Lethe, where the weary could forget. Acheron, where pain and sorrow gathered. Cocytus, the river of lamentation. And Phlegethon, where fire flowed, not to destroy, but to cleanse. These rivers were not born from his will alone, but from the echo of the world's endings. Hades simply gave them form. He did not seek to tame them, he gave them purpose. Next, he chose the place where his hall would be, not a castle towering with pride, but a sanctuary of stone nestled in the quietest fold of the realm. He built not upward, but inward. His throne was not high, but level with the floor, a seat carved from obsidian and stillness. The hall was vast, but not imposing. Its ceilings echoed only slightly, and the walls seemed to hum with the same deep vibration he had heard when first he entered the realm. He placed no golden lights or jeweled banners. Instead, dim torches burned with pale blue flames, not to dazzle, but to guide. The hall was a place of waiting, of transition. It was not a place to fear, it was a place to be acknowledged. He did not build it for power, but for clarity. For the souls who would come, confused and newly silent. He wanted them to feel that they had arrived somewhere real, somewhere final, somewhere safe. Though the realm was still mostly empty, he knew its time would come. And when it did, he would be ready, not as a judge on high, but as a quiet presence, steady and unmoving, who would greet each soul not with fire, but with stillness. He was no longer just a god. He was becoming a keeper, a guardian of what remained after the end. As time continued its slow spiral beyond the reach of mortal clocks, the realm of Hades began to take shape not only in structure, but in spirit. It was no longer just a hollow cradle beneath the earth. It was a realm with purpose, with direction, and soon with life of its own kind. Though no birds sang and no trees grew in the underworld, it was not a dead place. It was alive in a quieter way. Its life pulsed in the hush of its caverns, in the slow movement of its rivers, in the breathless rhythm of stone adjusting under cosmic weight. But a realm could not function by will alone. It needed hands, watchers, guardians. Not many, for Hades did not wish to fill his world with noise or crowds. He sought those who understood silence, who moved with respect, who would serve not him, but the balance he vowed to maintain. And slowly they came not from Olympus, but from the deep places where ancient spirits lingered. The first to arrive was Charon, a figure as still and expressionless as the river he would serve. Tall and robed in dark folds, with a face forever hidden in the shadow of his hood. Charon said no words and needed none. He bowed once to Hades and took up his task without ceremony, claiming the ferryman's post on the banks of the river Styx. There he would remain for all time, guiding souls across the dark waters, accepting only the payment of a coin, a symbol not of wealth, but of remembrance. For those who were buried with care, with rites and ritual, would come to Charon ready for passage. Those who had no coin, no honor, would linger on the banks for eternity, half-shadows in a land that would not yet receive them. Hades did not question Charon's silence, for it matched his own. He trusted the ferryman absolutely, for he too served not from ambition, but from understanding. Then came Cerberus, not born but brought forth by the will of the realm itself, 3 heads, each watching a different corridor of time. The great hound was terrifying to see, but never to Hades. To his master, Cerberus was loyal, calm, and often slept beside the throne like a massive, breathing shadow. No soul left once it entered, and none entered who was not meant to. That was Cerberus' purpose, and he fulfilled it with tireless grace. Other spirits found their place in time, spectral judges who would weigh the lives of mortals with impartial clarity. Aeacus, Rhadamanthus, and Minos, all former kings from the world above, now repurposed to serve the order of the Underworld. Each soul who passed through Hades' realm would stand before them, their lives reviewed not with punishment in mind, but with understanding. Where had they shown kindness? Where had they acted in selfishness? Where had they suffered quietly, and where had they caused harm? No story was simple, and the judges knew this. And Hades, who watched but never interfered, accepted their verdicts with quiet approval. Those whose lives had been balanced or gentle were guided to the fields of Asphodel, a place not of joy or pain, but of peaceful neutrality. Those who had lived with rare virtue, bravery, wisdom, or kindness beyond measure, were sent to the Elysian fields, a realm of soft light and endless calm. And those whose cruelty had torn at the fabric of life were cast into the deepest reaches of Tartarus, where even Hades would not tread. Yet he did not take pleasure in their punishment. He simply maintained the boundary, ensuring that what needed to be separated remained so. Thus, the underworld became whole, not through conquest or decree, but through harmony. Hades had shaped it as a reflection of his nature, quiet, watchful, orderly, and unwavering. It was not a place of horror, as mortals would later whisper in fear, but a realm of truth. Here all things ended not in chaos, but in rest. Here sorrow was heard, but not fed. Here memory lingered like mist, never sharp, never cruel, just present. And Hades, its keeper, did not sit on his throne with pride or hunger. He simply sat, his eyes open, watching the river flow, the halls breathe, the souls move in slow procession. He did not rule to be obeyed. He ruled because someone had to carry the weight of finality. Someone had to hold the silence so that the world above could sing. And in that silence, Hades found not loneliness, but purpose. A purpose older than worship, deeper than fear, and gentler than most would ever know. Chapter 4: The Realm of the Dead. At last, the underworld was no longer empty. As time unrolled its tapestry across the world above, mortals lived and died, and their souls began to drift downward, softly, like feathers carried on a wind that no one could feel. They arrived at the edges of Hades' realm quietly, without footsteps or voices, their shapes pale as early mist. Some came peacefully, having lived long lives filled with love and closure. Others arrived with confusion still clinging to them like fog, their deaths sudden or cruel, their hearts unready to let go. But all came eventually, and the gates of the underworld, tall and still, opened for them without sound. Charon waited on the dark banks of the Styx, as constant as stone. In his quiet boat, he ferried soul after soul across the black waters, each journey gentle, slow, and without words. Some souls wept, others whispered names of those they left behind. But Charon said nothing, and Hades, watching from afar, also did not interfere. He knew there were no words that could ease such partings. Instead, he offered something else: stillness. In this realm, There was no pain of hunger, no sharpness of grief, only the gradual fading of struggle. Time smoothed the edges of what had been. As the flow of souls increased, so too did the quiet rhythm of the realm. The judges, Aeacus, Rhadamanthus, and Minos, sat in a hall where light did not shine but softly glowed, like memory caught in crystal. Each soul stood before them and told the story of its life, not with mouths, but with presence. The judges did not speak quickly. They listened fully. They weighed every kindness, every wound, every regret, and every act of courage. Their judgments were not punishments, but reflections, truth offered with care. Some souls, when hearing their own stories echoed back to them, wept, not out of shame but out of recognition. Others bowed their heads, understanding at last the shape of their journey. Those whose lives were neither cruel nor exceptional were led to the fields of asphodel, where gray grasses swayed forever in a wind that had no direction. There the souls wandered, not lost, but simply at rest. Those rare ones who had lived with extraordinary grace were sent to the Elysian fields. That place shimmered softly, a realm not of joy alone, but of fulfillment. It was green and warm and timeless. And for the few whose actions had torn through the threads of life with deliberate malice, the road bent downward, far below the underworld proper, to the pit of Tartarus. Hades himself did not pass its gates. He did not need to. His task was not to punish, but to contain. He watched all this with neither pride nor sorrow. To mortals, death seemed like a rupture, a breaking away from everything beautiful and known. But to Hades, who sat in the very center of it all, death was something quieter. It was not the opposite of life, but the completion of it. Here, in his realm, everything that once was found a place to rest. He did not rush souls along their path, nor try to hold them longer than needed. Some clung to memory, unable to let go, and he gave them time. Others moved on swiftly, like leaves in a current, and he let them pass without interruption. There was no one way to enter death, and so he left room for every kind of ending. And when he passed through his own halls, walking among the mists and the memories, the souls did not cry out or fall to their knees. They simply watched him with quiet understanding. For though he was a god, he did not rule like those above. He was not removed from them. He was their last companion, the one who stayed when everyone else had gone. He did not promise joy or rebirth. He offered only peace, and for many that was enough. As the ages passed, and the world above spun through cycles of war and peace, love and loss, the underworld grew, not in size but in richness. It became a place layered with memory, echoing with stories that no longer needed to be told aloud. Souls settled into their afterlives like birds returning to nests they never knew they'd built. In the fields of asphodel, they wandered without urgency. There was no sun and no moon, but a soft, silvery light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air did not move with weather, but with a gentle rhythm, like breathing slowed to a whisper. The souls here were not happy in the way mortals imagine happiness, nor were they sorrowful. They simply were. They remembered fragments of their lives, sometimes vividly, sometimes faintly, but those memories no longer hurt. There were no more burdens, no more roles to play. Time, having carried them so far, now held them softly, as a hand might hold a fallen leaf, not to keep it, but to release it with care. These souls did not call out to Hades, but they felt him, always present at the edge of things, like the hush between thoughts. In the Elysian fields, the light was golden and warm, though it cast no shadows. Here, the air shimmered with music that had no beginning and no end, only a melody that filled the heart without asking for attention. The souls who walked there laughed softly, rested often, and looked upon one another not as strangers, but as companions, each one having reached this place through a different road, yet arriving with the same sense of quiet reward. They did not strive for more, for there was nothing more to earn. No gods visited them with demands. No duties pulled them from their peace. Hades watched over them from afar, not as a ruler, but as a gardener watches a field that grows gently on its own. He did not interfere. He did not need to. The world he had built allowed peace to take root and remain untouched. There was a purity in this silence that even Olympus could not match. No ambition disturbed it. No argument rose within it. And in that silence, something rare blossomed. Contentment without desire. Even Tartarus, the deepest part of the world below, had its place in this balance. Hades did not visit often, nor did he speak of it freely. But he did not turn away from it either. It was not his joy, but his responsibility. Far below the halls and rivers and fields, Tartarus yawned like a wound in the world, and there the most dangerous beings and cruelest souls were kept, bound not in anger, but in necessity. There were no torturers in Tartarus, no fires for the sake of pain. Only distance, containment, and quiet isolation. It was a place where harm could no longer spread, and Hades ensured that it remained sealed, watched by ancient forces that did not sleep. He did not look upon its prisoners with hatred, for he understood that even those who had caused great destruction had once been part of life. But his compassion did not override his duty. He carried the weight of that boundary with the same calm he carried all things. For every soul, no matter how lost, belonged somewhere, and if their place was isolation, then he would grant it without cruelty, only with finality. That was his strength, not wrath, not favor, but clarity. The ability to say, "This is where the story rests." And when he returned from those depths to the gentler regions of his kingdom, the silence of the underworld felt even more sacred. There were days, if they could be called that, when Hades would walk alone through his kingdom, with no guards beside him and no destination ahead. His steps were soft against the stone, and the folds of his dark robe whispered gently as they moved. He passed the silent gates, the judgment hall, the rivers and bridges, the endless fields of gray and gold. He walked not to survey or to correct, but simply to be present. It was through these solitary walks that he remained connected to what he ruled. He was not a god who stood above, distant and indifferent. He did not demand songs or prayers. He did not seek altars or sacrifice. He asked only for remembrance, and even that only gently. He did not desire to be feared. In truth, he did not desire to be known. And yet, for the souls who wandered his realm, his presence was deeply felt. When he passed, the air became still, not tense. His gaze brought no shame, only understanding. The souls bowed, not because they were commanded, but because they recognized in him something unshakable. Not authority, but presence. A God who did not speak often, but who always listened. A ruler who never looked away. There were moments when he would pause by the banks of Lethe, watching the souls who chose to bathe in its waters. They would step forward slowly, like sleepwalkers, their memories dissolving into the current, their pasts gently unknotted strand by strand. Hades never rushed them. He knew some souls needed to remember a while longer. Some held tightly to names, faces, promises, and final words. Others let go easily, relieved to forget the pain of mistakes and losses. Each one found their own way, and Hades honored that. To forget was not weakness, and to remember was not pride. Both were paths to peace. Sometimes, he would find himself standing in the fields of asphodel, the windless grasses brushing his ankles like old stories. The souls there did not speak, but they watched him with a kind of still affection. They knew he would keep them safe, not from harm, for none threatened them here, but from being lost. That was his greatest promise to them. Not immortality, not bliss, but place. To not be forgotten, to not be scattered. Even in silence he kept them close. When he returned to his throne, low and broad, carved from black marble and set not above his people, but among them, he sat not as a king demanding praise, but as a steward of stillness. The realm pulsed around him, not with noise, but with quiet life. He watched the flow of souls as a river watcher sees the current, not trying to control it, only making sure it stayed within its banks. There was no need for armies, for rebellions never rose among the dead. There was no need for feasts, for hunger did not exist here. There was only the long, quiet service of order, and Hades, more than any other god, was suited to such a role. He did not grow restless. He did not grow envious of Olympus with its golden halls and wild celebrations. He did not dream of the sky, for he had found something deeper, a truth that reached beneath all things, that life ends, that endings matter, that someone must keep the door between worlds. And so, as the ages turned above, and generations were born and buried, Hades sat where he had always been, between what was and what no longer needed to be. The dead came and he welcomed them. The dead stayed and he remembered them. And the world above continued, never quite aware that its heartbeat was only possible because, below it, a god sat in silence, holding the balance steady. Chapter 5: The Lonely King. In the depths of the world, where time slowed to the pace of stone breathing, and even memory faded into soft echoes, Hades sat upon his dark throne and listened. He was not bored. Boredom belonged to those who lacked purpose. He was not restless. Restlessness required something unresolved. No, what Hades felt was something far more subtle, like a low note held in the background of a song that never ended. He felt the stillness settle into him, not as a burden, but as a part of who he was. His realm was whole, his duties endless but calm. Souls continued to arrive each day, ferried across the Styx, gently judged, gently placed. No chaos reached him. No disorder shook the walls of his palace. And yet there was a feeling, one he did not often name. Not sorrow, not longing, but an awareness of absence. It was the shape of something that had never existed in his world, but which he now began to notice like a soft draft beneath a door. He would walk the long halls of his domain and pass by thousands of souls, none of whom could speak to him as an equal. They looked to him with reverence, yes, with peace even, but not with companionship. And though he had built a realm where no soul was forgotten, he began to wonder what it meant that he, the ruler, had never been truly known. He did not resent his brothers. Zeus had Olympus, with its golden light and endless celebration. Poseidon ruled the seas, vast and moody and filled with life. They had kingdoms loud with presence, filled with movement and adoration. But Hades had chosen the quiet. It had not been forced upon him, nor did he regret it. It suited him, the gentle weight of silence, the thoughtful cycles of endings, the slow rhythms of eternal rest. And yet, even silence can sometimes echo too sharply when no voice ever answers. There were moments, rare and private, when Hades would leave his throne and wander to the very edges of his realm, not to inspect, not to judge, but simply to feel the boundary where his world ended and the unknown began. He would look upward, not with envy, but with wondering. The sky was not visible from his realm, but he could sense its distance, its color, its warmth. He had not felt sunlight since his descent. He did not need it, yet something in him began to remember its presence, not as something to possess, but as something once known. And as he stood there at the edge of what he ruled, he would ask himself, not aloud but in thought, if there would ever come a soul who could walk beside him, not in fear or reverence, but in shared stillness. The creatures of his realm served faithfully. Cerberus, ever watchful, greeted his master with quiet loyalty. The judges performed their roles with fairness and resolve. Sharon continued to ferry souls with the same unchanging silence. The entire realm moved with the precision of a clock carved into the bones of the earth. But even the ticking of that clock could not fill the hollow left by something unnamed. And Hades, for all his calm and patience, began to notice the patterns of that emptiness more clearly. He began to hear his own footsteps more loudly in the corridors. He began to linger longer by the waters of Lethe, watching the ripples fade. And sometimes, though he never admitted it even to himself, he would imagine another presence walking with him through the halls, not to speak often, not to disturb the silence, but simply to share it. A presence that would not flinch at his gaze. A presence that would understand what it meant to carry not power, but permanence. He did not pray for such a being. He did not command it into existence. He simply left space for it in his mind. And slowly, that space began to take shape, not with urgency, but with quiet hope. From his throne below the earth, Hades began to look upward more often. Not with his eyes, for no mortal light reached his kingdom, but with his mind, with the quiet curiosity that had always stirred at the edges of his consciousness. Though the sky was far, and though his realm was sealed in silence, the god of the dead was not blind to what transpired above. He could feel the tremors of the seasons shifting, the pulse of the living world moving like a great ocean above his head. Spring's soft unfurling, summer's fevered bloom, autumn's quiet hush, and winter's deep exhale. They each had their own rhythm, and Hades, attuned to all endings, could sense their every breath. He began to study the patterns of mortal lives more closely, not from a desire to interfere, but from a gentle, growing wonder. What did it feel like to live just once, to love and lose, to rise and fall, to experience not eternity but urgency? He knew the weight of memory, the cost of time, but now he was drawn to the fragility of beginnings. There was something beautiful, even noble, in a life that bloomed just briefly and faded with grace. Souls told their stories as they passed through his realm, but the stories were always after the fact, softened by time, stripped of color. He began to yearn, not for the life itself, but for the full sound of it, still echoing in the air before it became memory. On rare occasions, he would ascend, not into the world of mortals, but to its borders. There were caves and cracks in the earth where the two realms brushed one another, where shadows stretched long and roots reached deep. In these liminal places, Hades would stand just beyond the veil, not crossing, only listening. The wind that moved through forests carried laughter and song. The rivers above danced in the sunlight, reflecting skies he had not seen in ages. He watched children run through fields without fear, lovers meet beneath trees, old men fall asleep in chairs as twilight settled around them. He saw suffering too, war, grief, cruelty, but even that had a strange, raw truth that he found compelling. Pain, unlike silence, demanded response, and love, unlike memory, demanded presence. The mortal world pulsed with meaning, not despite its fleetingness, but because of it. Hades did not envy it, but he began to admire it in a way he had never expected. It was imperfect, chaotic, and loud, but it was alive. And somewhere, in that dance of growing and fading, he sensed something calling to him. Not a voice, but a vibration, like a thread tugging gently at the edge of his stillness. He returned to his realm with new thoughts. He found himself walking differently through his halls, his pace just a little slower, his eyes more focused on the space around him, as if expecting something to appear. The souls of the dead noticed the shift, though they did not speak of it. They felt their king's awareness sharpen, his silence grow softer around the edges. He began to spend more time at the borders of the rivers, especially Lethe, where memory thinned and faded. He watched as souls stepped into the water and left their pasts behind, and he wondered what it might be like to start again. Not as a mortal, not in ignorance, but in presence. He would never abandon his duty. The underworld was his and he belonged to it. But he now saw that even in a place built on endings, something new might begin, not in defiance of death, but as part of it. He had ruled in solitude for so long that he had forgotten the shape of possibility. And now, possibility had stirred like dust in a shaft of light. He did not speak of it. He told no one, not the judges, not Sharon, not even Cerberus. But deep within, a question had begun to echo gently through him, returning again and again like waves against the shore. What if something or someone could live even here, beside him? Not to worship, not to serve, but to stay? The underworld remained unchanged in form, yet something had shifted in its essence. Though no new walls were raised, no rivers altered course, and no lights were kindled where there were none before, the very air seemed to carry a subtle tension, like the pause before rain or the stillness that comes just before a dream begins. The realm responded to Hades' quiet yearning, not with sound or signs, but with space. It was as if the world he had shaped was opening just slightly, stretching to make room for a presence it had never held. Hades felt it in the rhythm of his footsteps and in the echoes that followed him through empty corridors. He felt it in the still moments between his thoughts. He had ruled for countless ages without desire. But now, for the first time, he was not merely holding silence. He was waiting within it, waiting for something he could not name. He did not search. He did not reach. But he watched with a patience forged in eternity. The underworld had been born of necessity, but now it yearned not for change, but for fullness, for company, for meaning shared, not alone. And so he began to notice things more closely, the way mist curled around stone in the mornings when the realm stirred, the faint shimmer of soul light rising like dust in the far halls, the texture of still water, how it reflected his face differently depending on the river. He began to see the beauty in what he had built, not as a craftsman admires his work, but as a guardian finally understanding what he has been guarding. He found comfort in details that had once escaped his attention. The way Cerberus' middle head always tilted first when he approached, or how Sharon, though voiceless, paused his rowing when the wind changed direction. Even the silent judges, unmoving in their solemnity, seemed to carry traces of feeling in the way they exchanged glances when souls passed through. Hades had always believed he was set apart from all this, that he ruled and they served. But now he began to wonder if all along, the realm had been holding him just as much as he had been holding it. He began to walk not only to observe, but to belong. Still no one came. No presence stepped from the mist to take the empty place beside his throne. But Hades did not grow bitter. He did not fill the gap with anger or retreat into coldness. Instead, he opened more space inside himself. He accepted that longing could exist even in the heart of silence, and that it did not weaken him. On the contrary, it made his stillness deeper, more meaningful. For what is patience, if not the belief that something may one day arrive? He did not know whether he waited for a voice, a hand, a soul who would meet his eyes without fear. But he allowed the waiting to become part of him, softened him, not in power but in presence. And so he continued, as he always had, receiving souls, tending to the structure of the realm, listening without judgment. Yet something inside him had changed, and the realm itself, in its quiet way, responded. The shadows no longer felt heavy. The rivers no longer seemed endless. The silence no longer echoed as emptiness, but as readiness. And in that subtle, sacred quiet, Hades prepared, not for an ending, but for something rare and precious in his world of finality, a beginning. He did not know when it would come or in what form, but he knew this. He would recognize it when it did. Chapter 6. The Maiden of Spring. Far above the quiet halls of the Underworld, where the sky stretched endlessly in every direction and the wind danced with the scent of blooming fields, there lived a young goddess whose feet barely touched the earth when she walked. Her name was Persephone, though at that time the world still whispered her name like a song half remembered. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and from her mother she inherited the language of the earth, the rhythm of seeds, the music of rain, the sigh of wheat as it bowed in golden waves. But from somewhere deeper, from something unspoken and older, Persephone carried something her mother did not. She carried a wildness, soft but untamed, like the wind through young grass or the moment before a storm breaks. She did not walk in lines or speak in measured tones. She wandered, barefoot, crownless, unconcerned with thrones or titles. Her beauty was not of marble or fire. It was of growth, of green things pushing through soil, of blossoms breaking through frost. The world around her responded to her presence in ways no one fully understood. Flowers bloomed in her footsteps. Streams turned clearer as she passed. Even the animals paused, not in fear, but in reverent wonder. She was spring in motion, not merely a season, but the soul of renewal itself. Persephone spent her days far from Olympus, far from temples and courtly rituals. She walked through meadows humming to herself, weaving crowns of buttercups and poppies, whispering to frogs and bees as if they were old friends. The sun adored her, wrapping her in warmth without burning. The trees opened their branches to shade her path. She was never followed, yet never truly alone. The earth knew her. The air knew her. Even time seemed to slow when she paused to listen. But within that blooming brightness, there was also curiosity. Persephone, though surrounded by life, often looked past it, not in dissatisfaction, but in quiet wonder. She watched the petals fall as eagerly as she watched them bloom. She traced the shape of decaying leaves as lovingly as she plucked new ones. Unlike her mother, who clung to the living and shunned all else, Persephone did not turn away from change. She did not fear endings. When small creatures died, she buried them herself, pressing her hands into the soil with a kind of reverence, as though planting them for rebirth. Death, to her, was not wrong. It was simply part of the turning wheel, the deep exhale after the inhale. She felt it around her, not as an enemy, but as a secret not yet told, and though Persephone never spoke of it aloud, she often dreamed. In her dreams, she wandered places where no flowers grew, where the air was still and full of echo. She dreamed of caverns lit by dim blue light, of rivers that whispered not with voices, but with memory. She saw halls carved from silence and shadows that were not frightening, only vast. And sometimes, when she awoke, she would feel a pull, a gentle tug, like the tide brushing at the edge of her thoughts. She would stand in the middle of a meadow full of color and feel her heart tilt toward the dark horizon, wondering what lay beyond the world of blossoms and green. Her mother never noticed. Demeter, ever watchful and loving, assumed her daughter was content among the growing things, and Persephone never said otherwise. For what could she say when even she did not understand it? All she knew was that something was waiting, not in the sky, not in the sea, but somewhere deep below. And though she did not yet know his name, though his shadow had never touched her sunlight, Persephone was beginning to hear the silence that had waited for her since before the first flower opened its petals to the sun. Below the blossoming hills and golden meadows where Persephone danced, the quiet king began to feel a change in the air of his realm. Not loud, not sudden, but like a tremor too soft to shake stone yet impossible to ignore. It came first as a warmth he had never known in his kingdom. Not heat, but gentleness. Not fire, but life. As Hades sat upon his throne, one hand resting on the smooth arm of carved obsidian, he felt a shift in the flow of his thoughts. They wandered more than before. He found himself gazing into the pools along the banks of Lethe for longer moments, watching reflections ripple into softness. And in those ripples, though no face appeared, there was a feeling, a presence. Something bright but not blinding. Something light but not empty. It moved through his awareness like music hummed from a great distance, growing clearer only when he closed his eyes. At first, he thought it was simply longing, the echo of his own hope, projected into the silence. But it persisted. It began to return again and again, always just at the edge of knowing. And the more he felt it, the more he listened, not with his ears, but with the quiet within himself that had always waited. One day, as he stood near the border of his realm, where the earth thinned and the sounds of the world above trembled faintly through the stone, he heard something new. A laugh, not the kind of laughter he'd heard from souls long dead, brittle and fading, but something alive, clear, golden, like wind through bells. It was brief, no more than a breath, but it struck him. He turned his gaze upward, not with command, but with reverence, as if hoping to see the source. And though the earth did not part and no vision came, he felt the laugh settle deep inside him, as if it had always belonged there. That night, if such things could be called nights in a place without stars, Hades walked alone through the uppermost caverns of his realm. He did not speak. He simply moved, slowly, carefully, with the feeling still blooming in his chest. Somewhere above him, beyond the weight of the world, someone was stirring. He did not know her name. He did not need to. All he knew was that the stillness he had guarded for eons had changed. It was no longer just a wall of silence. It had become a doorway quietly opening. At the same time, in a meadow lit with morning light, Persephone stood ankle-deep in wildflowers and closed her eyes. The wind wrapped around her like a whisper, and she tilted her head as if listening to something beneath it. Her heart beat calmly, but with a strange new rhythm. She had always been part of the surface, of roots and wings and sun-warmed stone. But now her thoughts turned downward, drawn to the pull she could not name. That night, she dreamed again, but the dream was different. No longer was she a visitor to the underworld of shadow and silence. This time she was welcomed. The halls no longer loomed. They opened to her like outstretched arms. The rivers did not chill, they shimmered. And at the far end of the throne room, in the deep quiet, sat a figure cloaked in stillness. He did not rise, did not beckon, but when she looked at him, she felt no fear, only a knowing. She awoke not startled, but calm, and for the first time she did not return to the meadow. She walked instead to the edge of the grove, where the trees grew older and the ground felt heavier beneath her feet. Something waited, and she was no longer content to wonder. It happened not with thunder, nor with trembling earth, but with stillness. A stillness so complete, so breath-held and sacred, that even the roots in the soil seemed to listen. Persephone, guided by nothing more than instinct and dream, followed a path no map had drawn. Through the tall grasses she walked, then through dense groves where light filtered through green leaves like sighs. Each step took her further from her mother's warm embrace, from the golden laughter of the harvest, from the songs of birds she had known since childhood. But she did not feel lost. She felt called, the way rivers are called to the sea, the way seeds are called to split open and reach toward light, or in this case, toward dark. She reached the edge of the world as she knew it, a place where the sky dimmed and the air grew still, and the earth yawned open into something far older than memory. There, the entrance to the underworld waited, not as a gate of fear, but as a threshold, quiet and patient, like a door that had been unlocked for ages, simply waiting for someone to turn the handle. She stepped through, not with hesitation, but with breath held, heart open, soul listening. Hades knew the moment she entered, not by sight, for she was still far from his throne, not by sound, for she made none, but by feeling. A ripple passed through the stone, through the rivers, through the air itself. Not disturbance, presence. The kind of presence that belongs exactly where it stands. He rose, slowly, from his throne, not in urgency, but in reverence. No soul had ever entered this place of their own will, not like this. The dead arrived because they must, but she came because something within her had answered something within him. He did not rush to meet her. That was not his way. Instead, he began to walk the paths of his realm, not seeking but opening, letting her draw near not through command, but through invitation. And as they approached each other, one from the surface, one from the deep, neither spoke, yet something between them unfolded with the care of a flower blooming in the dark. Persephone did not flinch when she saw him. She did not bow nor look away, and Hades, though his heart thundered like a great drum inside the stillness of his chest, did not hide. They stood facing one another, in a hall lit only by the gentle glow of the river that wound nearby. For a long moment, nothing moved, and then, only then, he spoke. His voice was low, as if it belonged to the stone itself, but it was not cold. It was the voice of patience, of waiting, of something ancient finally allowed to exhale. He did not ask her why she came. He did not offer her gold or power or kingdom. He simply asked her name, not because he did not know it, but because he wanted to hear her speak it. And when she did, softly, clearly, without fear, it felt like a chord struck deep in the foundation of the realm. Light did not burst forth, but something deeper shifted. The underworld, for the first time, did not feel like a realm built solely for endings. It felt like a place where something new might begin. Neither of them knew what would follow, or how the world above would tremble when it learned what had passed between them. But in that moment, beneath the earth, beneath the weight of time and the quiet of ages, two beings met not as ruler and visitor, not as shadow and light, but as equals, as echoes answering across the silence, as spring meeting stone, and the underworld, keeper of all things final, held its breath. For something had entered that even death had never known, the soft, patient beginning of love. Chapter 7. The Queen Beneath the Earth. Persephone remained in the underworld, not as a prisoner, not even as a guest, but as something more unusual and sacred, a presence. The halls did not close behind her, nor did Hades seal the gates. She stayed because she chose to, though perhaps she did not yet know why. The first days passed like dreams. She wandered slowly, barefoot upon cold stone, her fingers brushing the walls as if memorizing their texture. The air was unlike anything she had known, neither stale nor sweet, but ancient, as though it had been waiting untouched for eons just to meet her breath. Shadows curled softly around her but never clung. Silence rose to meet her like a blanket, not to smother, but to comfort. She did not speak much in those days, but neither did Hades. He kept a respectful distance, never demanding, never explaining. He watched from afar as she explored, his presence always near but never heavy. And the underworld, used to the slow procession of quiet souls and predictable judgment, felt different. Something within it seemed to listen now, to lean gently toward her as flowers lean toward light. Even Cerberus, terrible and loyal, followed her steps not as a guard, but as a shadow curious and careful, tail wagging in slow arcs as she passed. Persephone found herself drawn to the rivers, each with its own voice. She would sit by the banks of Lethe for hours, fingers skimming the surface, feeling the pull of forgetting without ever stepping in. "Not yet," she whispered once to the water, though no one had asked her. By Acheron she wept without knowing why, her tears joining those of centuries past. By Phlegethon she sat cross-legged, eyes closed, letting the soft hiss of flame lull her thoughts into stillness. She walked through the fields of asphodel and spoke to the wandering souls, not in words, but with glances, with shared presence. Some remembered her from life as a feeling, a dream, a name carried on spring winds. Others simply recognized that she was different, not like the others who ruled. She did not command, but the land responded to her. Where she sat, moss began to grow, not green, but pale blue, delicate as breath. Where her feet touched, the stone warmed, not visibly, but enough for passing souls to feel it and pause. Hades watched all this quietly. He had ruled for so long in order, in silence, in patience, and now he saw something new. Not chaos, not disruption, but transformation. His realm was not changing. It was blooming in slow, dark light. And Persephone, for her part, did not try to become something she was not. She did not pretend to be a queen, yet she carried herself with quiet strength. The throne beside Hades remained empty for many days, untouched. She never approached it, and he never offered it. But over time, she began to sit beside him, not on the throne, but close enough that their silence could be shared. They spoke more often now, their voices low, their words few but carefully chosen. She asked him about the dead, not just who they were, but how they felt. He told her of memory and weight, of sorrow and release. She listened without flinching. He asked her of the world above, and she told him of growing things and how it felt to watch a bud become a blossom. Their exchange was not a courtship in the way of gods, not filled with fireworks or proclamations. It was something softer, the slow unfolding of trust. Two souls who had always moved in opposite rhythms now found themselves weaving a new one together. And though neither called the other by title, the realm itself began to know her not only as Spring's daughter, but as the presence beside the king. Not just Persephone, but the queen beneath the earth. With each passing day, Persephone began to sense that the underworld was no longer entirely Hades alone. She did not take it from him, nor did he offer it to her in full, but something subtle had shifted in the realm's breath. When she walked through its corridors, the silence felt warmer. The walls seemed to hold their stillness with a softer touch. The torches along the halls, which once burned in steady, colorless flame, now flickered with pale golden hues when she passed. It was not a transformation born of command. It was the quiet work of coexistence. Persephone had not come to rule. She had come to listen, and by doing so, the realm began to respond in ways it never had before. When she touched the black stone of the palace walls, they no longer felt cold. When she entered the judgment hall, the echoes of centuries seemed to fall quiet, as if pausing to greet her. Even the rivers, bound by their ancient courses, began to sing in lower, smoother tones. It was as if the underworld, which had long held only endings, was learning to hold pause. Not life, not rebirth, but breath. Gentle, still breath. A T first. Persephone was unsure of what this meant. She had not planned to stay long. Her heart had expected a visit, not a homecoming. But the more she moved through the underworld, the more she recognized something reflected back at her. Not from Hades, but from the realm itself. Like her, it had been misunderstood. To the surface, it was a place of horror and gloom. To Olympus, it was a footnote, an afterthought. But here, within its depth, she saw truth. This realm was not dead. It was waiting. It was listening. It was whole. It was slow, yes, but that slowness had grace. She had grown up with growth all around her. Flowers and wheat, vines and fruits, and in that constant blooming, there was always motion. But here, in this place without seasons, she discovered something rarer. Stillness that did not rot. Stillness that held. Stillness that honored what came before. And as she sat beside the river Lethe one evening, her feet resting just above the surface, she realized she did not miss the sunlight. She did not miss the noise or the color or even the scent of the blossoms above. What she missed, she carried inside her. And what she needed now was already beginning to surround her. Her bond with Hades deepened without words. They spoke, of course, when words were needed, but more often, they sat in silence. His presence heavy and calm, hers light and observing. She did not try to fill the silence. She joined it, and to Hades, who had known eons of solitude, her company did not disrupt his rhythm. It enriched it. He began to speak more freely when they were alone, not of rules or gods, but of thought, of feeling, of the meaning he had found in his long stewardship. He told her about the way certain souls clung to memory, and others melted into peace. He shared how the river Styx had changed its song after her arrival, as though it too had found something new to carry. And Persephone listened with her whole self, not only with her ears, but with the roots of her being. She absorbed what he said the way spring absorbs the melt of winter, slowly, without force, and in return, she began to share stories of above, of mornings when the fog curled through the fields, of the way the earth smelled when it rained, of how sometimes a flower bloomed where none should, and how that never stopped feeling like a miracle. And Hades, who had not seen a flower bloom in an age, listened as if he could see it, through her eyes, through her breath, through her voice. In time, the underworld began to speak her name, not in voices, but in gestures. Where once the realm had held its breath, now it exhaled gently when she passed. The rivers that had long flowed in solemn silence now carried a murmur, not unlike lullabies. The stone corridors no longer echoed emptiness but retained warmth where her footsteps had touched. Even the fields where the dead wandered without direction began to shift, ever so slightly. The grasses of asphodel swayed in response to her presence, and where she lingered, soft lights rose from the ground like forgotten fireflies. Souls who had once drifted as shadows paused when she entered. They turned not in fear, but in recognition. She did not offer them promises. She did not try to fix what death had done, but she gave them attention, and in that simple act, something healing stirred. She learned their names when they remembered them. She sat among them in silence, allowing them to be seen, not as ghosts or regrets, but as what they had always been, lives that had mattered. Even when they no longer remembered who they had been, her gaze assured them that they still existed, still belonged, that even here, beyond the borders of breath, someone saw them and did not turn away. Persephone, without effort, began to fulfill a role no one had named for her. She did not wear a crown of iron, nor sit beside Hades on equal throne, but the realm now moved with her as surely as it had once only obeyed him. Her presence brought balance not by rule, but by rhythm. She was not sunlight breaking through darkness. She was the hush that follows a long rain, the soft roots beneath the surface, the feeling of something blooming unseen. The underworld had known endings since its first stone was placed, but now it began to know continuance. Not resurrection, not reversal, but persistence. A soul did not have to be forgotten to be at rest. A realm did not have to remain unchanged to remain whole. And Hades, who had lived for ages believing he must guard order with unyielding silence, now found that order could be tended, like a garden that grows even in shadow. They still sat in quiet much of the time, but now that quiet held new weight. It was no longer the absence of words. It was the fullness of presence. Two deities, shaped by opposite elements, no longer opposed each other. They mirrored, they complemented, they filled in the hollow places the other had left untouched. The throne beside Hades remained empty for a long time, not because Persephone was unwelcome, but because neither of them rushed what was becoming. And then, one day, without fanfare or declaration, she simply sat there. Not because she was told, not because a title was offered, but because it felt right. Hades said nothing, but his eyes held something more enduring than praise. He saw her, not just as visitor or goddess or guest, but as his equal, the queen, the one who had walked into his world of her own will, who had not been afraid of his silence, who had not tried to brighten what was meant to be still, but had softened it instead. She had not asked for power, and yet the realm now moved to accommodate her. Roots reaching upward from the stone, gentle colors blooming in the corners of the palace, even time itself seeming to flow more gently through the underworld. The souls knew her, the rivers knew her, and Hades, who had once believed his eternity would pass untouched by warmth, now sat beside a goddess who carried spring not only in her hands, but in her soul. Together they ruled not through dominance or demand, but through understanding. And beneath the earth, in a kingdom built from silence, something extraordinary had begun to take root, a harmony that belonged to both shadow and bloom. Chapter 8. The Pact of the Seasons. Far above the quiet beauty of the underworld, where spring had always returned without hesitation, a change was felt. At first it was subtle. The buds on trees hesitated to open. The grasses remained dull where they once shimmered with green. Birds that had sung at dawn now perched in silence. And Demeter, goddess of the harvest, began to feel something she had never known before: the absence of her daughter. She searched for Persephone across the fields, calling her name through groves and meadows, expecting laughter to echo in return. But no answer came. The winds did not carry her footsteps. The flowers did not bloom beneath her touch. Fear, foreign and sharp, crept into Demeter's heart. She asked the other gods, had anyone seen her child? Olympus gave no answer. The nymphs said nothing. The earth, which had once whispered secrets into her hands, now held its silence. As days passed, then weeks, Demeter's worry grew into grief, and grief into rage. She was a goddess of life, of abundance, of nourishment, but that life was tied to Persephone like the root to the tree. Without her, Demeter could not give. The fields withered, the crops died. Frost crept into the soil even as the sun still shone. Mortals cried out in hunger, but no harvest came, and still Persephone did not return. In her sorrow, Demeter abandoned Olympus. She clothed herself in dark robes and wandered the world of men, disguising her divinity in the body of an old woman, walking from village to village in search of news, in search of hope. She found neither. Her eyes grew hollow, and her heart turned inward, and the world suffered with her. Without her blessing, the soil hardened. Trees refused to bear fruit. Rivers slowed. Even the animals forgot their songs. Life, once her domain, was slipping into memory. Eventually, her cries reached the ears of Zeus, not because he feared her, but because he feared what would come if she could not be comforted. The prayers of starving mortals filled the skies, and the balance of the world began to tilt. So he looked where none had dared, beneath the earth. It was Hermes, swift messenger of gods and one of the few who could cross the realms freely, who descended into the underworld on Zeus's command. He found Hades and Persephone in quiet companionship, not cloaked in shadows and chains as the stories might suggest, but seated beside one another, hands resting gently between them, their voices calm. Hermes, surprised, delivered his message with care. "Demeter mourns," he said. "The world withers. She calls for her daughter." Persephone listened, and her heart ached. She had not forgotten her mother. She had simply become whole in a way she had never expected. She loved Demeter with the love of seed for soil, of child for warmth, but she also felt something new in herself now, something rooted in the dark. She had not been taken. She had grown. Still, she knew she could not stay forever without consequence. Hades, ever silent, did not ask her to choose. Instead, he looked into her eyes and said only this: "What you are in both worlds." It was not a plea. It was a truth. And with that, Persephone rose, not with sorrow, but with calm. She kissed the cool stone of the underworld one last time before ascending with Hermes. When she reached the surface, the world exhaled. Flowers opened again. Trees began to breathe. The first rains returned. And when Demeter saw her daughter's face, she wept, not just with grief, but with overwhelming, breaking relief. She held Persephone close, as if to never let go again. But in her daughter's gaze, she saw something different. There was love, but also depth. There was spring, but also shadow. Persephone had changed, and the world would have to change with her. Olympus stirred when Persephone returned. The gods, ever watchful, ever wary of change, gathered in their golden halls to speak of what had come to pass. Some were surprised, others were silent. A few, like Apollo and Artemis, saw in her eyes a quiet strength they had not expected. She stood before them not as a lost daughter, but as a woman who had walked willingly into shadow and returned with stillness woven into her soul. Zeus listened first to Demeter, whose voice trembled with fierce emotion. She spoke of hunger, of loss, of a world brought to its knees by her grief. She demanded that Persephone remain in the world above forever, that no god should ever again take what was not freely given. Her words thundered through the halls like summer storms. But when Persephone raised her voice, the room grew still. She did not argue. She did not beg. She simply told the truth. She had descended freely. She had remained willingly. Hades had not tricked her. He had not chained her. He had offered her silence, presence, truth, and she had accepted. But she had also heard the cry of the earth. She had felt her mother's longing. She knew what must be done. She could not live only in one world. She belonged to both. It was then that Hades himself, unseen by most gods since the Titanomachy, rose from the depths and stood beside her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough. He spoke few words. "What she is now," he said, "is more than spring, more than shadow. She is the line between. And so let the world change to meet her." His tone held no challenge, no threat, only truth. The gods, for once, listened not as rulers, but as witnesses to something older than law. They looked upon Hades and saw not the grim king they had long imagined, but a figure of patience, of quiet strength, of enduring balance. They looked upon Persephone and saw not a child, but a queen, not crowned with gold, but with purpose. And so a compromise was formed, not of power, but of rhythm. For half the year, Persephone would walk upon the earth. The world would bloom in her presence. The fields would rise again, and Demeter's joy would spill into grain and fruit and flower. The rivers would sing, and mortals would rejoice. But for the other half, she would return below, not in sorrow, but in harmony. And during those months the world would rest. The trees would bare their branches. The ground would grow cold. The fields would sleep, and Demeter, though aching, would know this rhythm not as punishment, but as the cycle of love. Thus was the pact made, not carved into stone, but into time itself, a balance born not of law, but of understanding. Persephone would be both blossom and root, both arrival and return. Spring and autumn would carry her breath, and in between, the world would hold its breath and wait. The seasons would no longer be accidents of weather, but echoes of her journey, her descent and her return. The gods agreed, and no thunder followed. There was only stillness, the kind that comes after something sacred has been spoken aloud. Demeter, though her heart was torn, saw that her daughter had not been taken from her. She had become more. She had become herself. And so, with a heavy but open heart, she agreed. And the world turned, not back to what it had been, but into something wiser. When the pact was sealed, not with blood, not with magic, but with breath shared and hearts understood, the world itself responded. The very soil, long starved of rhythm, began to pulse again. Crops returned slowly, as if awakening from a heavy sleep. Trees, bare for what had felt like years, stretched their limbs skyward and began to bud with cautious green. Rivers, once slowed in sorrow, found their current again. The birds sang with new voices, not loud and wild, but soft, as though testing the melody of a changed world. The mortals, though they did not understand the full tale of what had occurred, felt it. They marked the seasons differently now. They spoke of the time when the world awakens and the time when it rests. They planted in reverence and harvested in gratitude. And though they still feared winter and prayed for the sun, they no longer saw the cold as punishment. It was simply part of the breath of life, the time when the queen walked below. Persephone, too, changed not in nature but in knowing. She no longer felt torn between two lives. She had not left one realm for another. She had become the thread between them. On the surface, she walked through golden fields, her fingers trailing through tall grasses, her laughter once more part of spring's song. But even there, the underworld moved within her like a second heartbeat. She noticed the places where things faded, the falling leaf, the last bloom before frost, the silence that followed summer's end. And she honored those things. She no longer saw death as absence. She saw it as rest, as necessity, as the gentle turning of something deeper. And when the time came, she returned to the underworld not as a prisoner nor as a reluctant bride, but as a queen. She stepped through the gates with grace, the air greeting her like an old friend. Hades met her with the same quiet presence, neither eager nor possessive. They walked together through the halls she now knew as well as her own thoughts, and the stones hummed softly beneath their steps. The underworld, in her presence, did not grow brighter. It grew fuller. In the cycles that followed, the world learned her name. Not just Persephone of spring, but Persephone of the turning, Persephone of the two realms. Temples rose not only in sunlit meadows, but in shaded groves and quiet caves. Offerings were left for her in both blooming petals and woven shadow. Women prayed to her for strength in change. Mothers whispered her name when children left home. Farmers honored her in the stillness between seasons. Even the dying, when they closed their eyes, sometimes saw her walking beside them, not to lead them away, but to keep them company as they crossed. She had become something more than goddess, more than queen. She had become a rhythm, promise, a breath, the one who goes and returns, the one who loves both light and dark. The pact made in sorrow had become the grace of balance, and above and below, in blossom and in frost, in silence and in song, Persephone's presence became the unseen thread that stitched the world together. She was no longer just the daughter of Demeter. She was the reason the earth remembered to wake, and the reason it remembered how to sleep. Chapter 9. The Cycle Eternal. The world, once ruled by chaos and the moods of gods, began to take on a gentler rhythm. Not because the heavens had changed, but because a single story had begun to pulse through time, quiet and steady as a heartbeat beneath soil. The story of a maiden who became a queen. The story of descent, return, and the still point between. It was whispered not only in temples, but in the rustle of leaves and the hush of snowfall. It found its way into the breath of the earth, into the curve of the moon, into the turning of every tide. Mortals, though they lived only brief lives, came to feel that rhythm deep in their bones. Without knowing why, they planted when the warmth returned and rested when the cold arrived. They watched the first crocus push through melting snow with the same wonder their ancestors had felt, though they no longer remembered the names. They wept in autumn not because they feared death, but because something ancient within them remembered farewell. And each spring, when the blossoms opened again, they smiled, not just at beauty, but at reunion. The gods, in their immortality, moved slower, but even they felt the change. The days of fierce decrees and divine tempests began to soften. Where once they ruled with spectacle, they now observed in silence. For even gods, in the face of true balance, must bow to something greater than power. And there was great power in what Persephone had become. Not a warrior, not a thunderer, not a ruler of flame or flood, but a keeper of rhythm. Her name became part of the cycle, not in marble inscriptions, but in the quiet knowledge passed from mother to daughter, from elder to child. That to love is to lose, that to lose is to wait, that to wait is to return, that there is time for blooming and time for falling away. The underworld, once feared as final, became something else in the imagination of mortals. A place of peace, a home for memory, a chamber where nothing is rushed, where everything is held. Not a punishment, but a pause. And Persephone was not its gatekeeper. She was its breath. Even Hades changed, though he remained who he had always been. His silence grew deeper, not heavier, but fuller. He walked his halls not as a figure apart, but as part of the rhythm itself. No longer only judge and watcher, he became companion. The souls who passed into his realm were still weighed, still placed, but now they felt not only the gravity of death, but the gentleness of being received. And when Persephone walked beside him, the halls of shadow held a strange glow, not light, but awareness. A knowing. The dead knew her not as salvation, but as stillness, as the one who had walked away and returned, as the one who had chosen to remain when she could have fled. Her presence told them that even here, even now, they were not lost. They were part of something greater, something that moved like seasons, like breath, like time itself. And so the world spun not just through space, but through meaning, through love, through rest, through return. And at its center, quiet and unwavering, stood the rhythm made flesh, Persephone, the eternal turning. Time passed as it always does, but now it passed in a pattern, not as a river rushing blindly, but as a tide that knew when to rise and when to rest. The seasons, once erratic in the minds of mortals, began to carry meaning. Children born in spring were said to carry the breath of Persephone. Those born in winter were watched with quiet reverence, as if they bore a little of the underworld's peace in their gaze. The stories changed, but never died. Some spoke of Persephone as a captive, others as a goddess of two worlds, and still others saw her simply as the reason the earth breathes in and out. But all the stories, no matter how differently told, carried the same rhythm at their core: the descent and the return, life and pause, growth and stillness. Over time, the temples grew old, the statues wore down, empires rose and crumbled, new gods were worshipped, Old ones were forgotten, but in the fields the flowers still knew when to bloom. In the soil the seeds still knew when to sleep. The rhythm outlived the stories, and the story outlived its name. Persephone was no longer just a figure in the sky or beneath the earth. She was in the rhythm of all living things. She was in the way a mother looked at her sleeping child, knowing that childhood would pass, and yet loving it anyway. She was in the hands of the farmer, planting without knowing if rain would come, trusting that it always had before. She was in the quiet between two lovers when words are no longer needed. She was in the way an old woman smiled at the falling leaves, not with sadness, but with understanding. Her myth became a kind of mirror, one that did not show gods and crowns, but the sacred truth of cycles. Humans began to feel less afraid of change, less afraid of grief, not because it hurt less, but because they had begun to sense that grief was not an end. It was part of the way things turned. Just as frost was not the death of the field, but its rest. Just as dusk was not the failure of light, but its pause. Persephone taught the world that waiting is not emptiness. It is preparation. Even in the quietest places, deep forests, high mountains, the corners of candlelit rooms, there were those who felt her presence. They did not need altars. They did not need names. They felt it in their breathing, in their slowing, in the way their hearts made peace with change. And so, slowly, gently, humanity changed as well. Not away from pain, but toward a deeper endurance, a deeper beauty. People began to plant in memory of those they'd lost, not to forget, but to remember that life moves forward in cycles. Artists painted the seasons not just in color, but in meaning. Poets wrote of return, of waiting, of love that survives the dark. And though many never spoke her name, Persephone lived in their gestures, in their quiet strength, in their choice to keep going, again and again, through cold, through stillness, toward whatever light might come. She was not salvation. She was not the promise of no pain. She was the rhythm that reminded them, "You will bloom again." And so, without announcement or decree, the tale of Persephone became not only a story but a presence that wove itself into the pattern of life. It was no longer only told aloud, but felt in the shift of wind before a storm, in the stillness between breaths, in the hush of snowfall when the world seems to hold itself quietly. People no longer needed to believe in gods to sense her. She was in the way trees let go of their leaves without protest. She was in the way snow blanketed the earth, not to smother it, but to cradle it until spring. Her story existed wherever there was transition, in every goodbye whispered with hope, in every grief that held, within its ache, the promise that something would grow again. And Hades, too, became something more, not just the king of the dead, not a cold figure in shadow, but a part of the great silence that lets life rest. He was the guardian of peace, of endings that were not failures, but part of a sacred turn. Through Persephone, his realm had been seen, not with fear, but with reverence. And together, though they ruled in darkness, their love shaped light. It is said that even now, if you sit very still in early autumn, just as the last leaves begin to fall, you can feel it. The hush before Persephone begins her descent. The world does not mourn. It waits. It breathes in, prepares. And when the frost first kisses the fields, when the skies grow pale and the nights stretch long, the earth is not afraid. It knows she is not gone forever. She walks below now, through halls of quiet stone, hand in hand with the God who waits for her in patience. And when the time comes again, when the rivers rise with snowmelt and the buds push through thawed ground, she will return. Not because she escaped, but because she chose. And the world will exhale. Flowers will open. Fields will sing. Children will laugh again in the sunlight. and no one will need to speak her name to feel her in the warmth beneath their feet. That is the nature of a true cycle, not imposed but felt, not demanded but trusted. And so, year after year, the world remembers her without remembering why. Simply turns like a wheel that never breaks. And in that turning there is peace. There is meaning. There is rhythm that asks for no effort, only presence. The story of Persephone and Hades is not just about gods, nor even just about seasons. It is about waiting and returning, about knowing when to move and when to be still. It is about how love does not always roar. It sometimes sits quietly beside you in the dark and asks nothing but that you stay. It is about how endings are not failures, and beginnings are not promises. They are simply the breath of the world, rising and falling like sleep. The myth lives not in temples, but in your pulse. Not in thunder, but in breath. And if ever you find yourself in the quiet between things, in the stillness after a loss, in the hush before a beginning, know that you are not alone. Persephone has been there before. She will be there again. And like the world, like time, like love itself, you too will bloom again. Chapter 10. The Garden Beneath the World. Beneath the world of sound and sunlight, deeper than roots, deeper than memory, there is a place that does not shift with storms or tremble beneath time. It is not marked on maps, nor spoken of in crowded halls. It is a place known only in stillness, in the quiet just before waking, in the hush that follows a heartbeat, in the breath that lingers when words have stopped. Here, in the vastness beneath all things, there is a garden, not of roses or vines, not of color that dazzles the eye, but of silence made visible. Soft moss curls across dark stone. Pale blossoms glow with the memory of moonlight. The air carries no scent, yet smells of something deeply familiar, like sleep, like memory, like something you once knew before you were born. And at the center of this garden walk two figures. One tall and cloaked in shadow, not frightening but still. The other graceful, with a crown of woven light and dusk. Hades and Persephone, king and queen, shadow and bloom. They do not speak often here, for nothing needs to be said. Everything has already been spoken in the rhythm of the earth above. This garden was not planted. It grew slowly over centuries of presence. It grew where her footsteps lingered. It bloomed where his silence softened. No hand forced it open. No power claimed it. It came into being the way rest follows effort, the way dusk follows day, not as an end, but as a gentle turning. The flowers here do not wither. They do not spread wildly. They simply exist, content in their place, their season, their moment. Souls sometimes wander here, drawn not by duty but by peace. They do not disturb the garden. They walk its edges, their forms faint, like mist shaped by longing. And sometimes, when they pause beneath the silver-leaved trees, they remember not who they were, but how it felt to be whole. That is the garden's gift, not knowledge, but quiet. Not answers, but stillness. It is the last room of the world, and perhaps the first. A place outside of endings. A place outside of time. And in its center, Hades and Persephone tend to nothing, because nothing here needs tending. Only presence. Only breath. Persephone, when she walks among these soft paths, often trails her fingers along the moss. She hums sometimes, melodies without name, and the garden seems to exhale in response. She is not sorrowful here, nor is she radiant. She is something softer, whole. And Hades, who once believed himself only a keeper of endings, watches her not with longing, but with reverence. He has learned that some things grow not despite shadow, but because of it, that some blossoms open only in the dark. When she turns to him, they do not speak of what was or what will be. They simply share the moment, And beneath the world, in the quietest place it knows, the story does not end. It rests, it breathes, it becomes the soil from which all other stories grow. There is something sacred about a place where nothing is asked of you. No decisions to be made, no roles to play, no questions to answer. The garden beneath the world is such a place. Souls who wander here are not summoned, nor are they turned away. They arrive not with fear, but with a kind of wonder, as though they have stepped into a memory they didn't know they had. Time here folds in on itself. You can sit beneath a tree that hasn't grown yet, or listen to the echo of footsteps not yet taken. The garden holds all things gently: regret, joy, love, rest. Nothing must be resolved here. Nothing must be earned. It is a place that simply allows you to be. Some say this is where dreams go when they are no longer needed. Others say it is where dreams are born before they reach the waking mind. But perhaps it is neither. Perhaps it is simply the still point, the hush between inhale and exhale, where the whole world briefly holds its breath and remembers that it is whole. Persephone often finds herself sitting on a smooth black stone that overlooks a small pool, fed by a spring that flows not from a mountain or river, but from somewhere older, perhaps from within the earth's own breath. The water is clear but never still. It ripples softly, even without wind, as though stirred by the memory of touch. She sits for hours, sometimes with her feet just grazing the surface, sometimes with her hands folded quietly in her lap. She does not speak, but the garden listens to her. It listens not with ears, but with presence. Flowers near her shift slightly as she thinks. The light changes in tone when she smiles. She carries no staff, no emblems of power. She does not need them. Her presence alone is a blessing, not one imposed, but one offered gently, like an open hand. Here she is not the queen, not the maiden, not even the myth. She is simply a being who knows both the light and the dark, and holds both without fear. Hades does not often walk far in the garden. His role is stillness, and his stillness holds the shape of the place. But he watches, and in his watching there is great care. He stands often at the entrance, where the garden fades back into the deeper halls of the underworld, as if guarding not from danger, but from forgetting. He does not speak often here, but when he does, his words are slow and few, each one placed like a stone in a river, redirecting the current in some subtle, unspoken way. The souls who see him do not bow. They nod or smile faintly or lower their gaze in a quiet greeting. No one here is lesser or greater, only present. And when Persephone rises from the poolside and walks back to him, they stand for a moment side by side, watching the garden breathe. There is no need to go elsewhere, no need to plan or decide. The garden asks for nothing but this, to be here now. And so they remain, not because they must, but because the world above turns on their rhythm, and the world below rests on their breath. And together, they hold the stillness that allows all things to begin again. If you were to wander to the edge of dreams, past the flickering lanterns of memory, beyond the soft veil of sleep where stories turn to silence, you might find it. You would not know how you arrived. You might not even be sure you are truly there, but you would feel it, first in your breath, then in your chest, then in the deep part of you that does not speak in words. A stillness, a warmth, a waiting that asks nothing from you. The garden does not open like a gate. It unfolds gently around your presence. There are no signs, no markers, no grand trees carved with prophecy. Only a path that curves as if shaped by kindness. And the deeper you walk, the quieter everything becomes. Not with emptiness, but with fullness. The kind of quiet that carries the hum of everything you've ever loved. The kind of quiet that feels like being held. You may sit here if you wish, You may sleep, you may simply listen. The stones are warm, the air is soft, and time forgets itself in this place. There is no need to remember. There is only now, only this moment, only peace. Some say that this garden is where the world ends. Others say it's where the world begins. But perhaps it is neither. Perhaps it is simply the space the world needs in order to turn. The breath between seasons, the pause between death and birth, the sigh between grief and grace. Here, Persephone and Hades do not rule. They do not command. They simply are. And that is enough. They walk without destination. They rest without agenda. Their love, so often misunderstood, is not a flame or a storm. It is a rhythm, presence, promise kept in silence. It does not ask to be seen. It does not need to be proven. It is the root beneath the tree, the hand beneath the falling leaf, the voice that says nothing and somehow still tells you that you are not alone, that the dark is not the end, that return is always possible, that everything rests and then wakes, and then rests again. So when your own days begin to slow, when the warmth fades from the sky, when the paths ahead blur, when your breath grows long and your thoughts grow quiet, remember this. There is a garden beneath the world. It waits not for the mighty, not for the perfect, but for all who need stillness. It is tended by silence, watched over by shadow, blessed by a queen who knows both beginning and end, and a king who holds the middle between. They will not call to you, they will not beckon, but if you ever arrive, they will be there. They will not ask your name. They will not need to. You will sit, you will rest, and the world will turn again, and again, and again. And in that turning, you will not be lost. You will be part of the rhythm. You will be part of the garden. And in the hush that follows the story's end, you will sleep. Thank you for listening. The tale has ended, but the rhythm remains. Seasons will turn, shadows will rest, and you will bloom again. If the story brought you calm, warmth, or peace, I invite you to gently subscribe and leave a like as a soft offering. It means more than you know. Until next time, sleep well and dream deep.